here we go. So, folks, I would like to open our session by expressing my gratitude that we are able to gather this evening on the shared, unceded territories of the Lilwat people, known in their language as Lilwa'ul, and the Squamish people, known in their language as Skahomish. We are very lucky to live, work, and play on these territories, and it feels especially important to acknowledge that when we are talking about the land, literally. We are talking about working the land this evening, and growing beautiful things and how to care for our gardens. On the note of our territories, I did want to mention to everybody here that the library will be closed on September 30th for the first annual Day of Truth and Reconciliation. But I do want to let you know that myself and our public services librarian Nadine will be on site, and we will be giving away 100 books about truth and reconciliation. There will be fiction and nonfiction, and there will be books for all ages. So if you're interested in continuing your learning on that subject, you can stop by the library on September 30th, on the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, and get a free book. We will be announcing the hours soon. We won't be there all day, but we'll announce the window of time that we'll be there very soon. We're going to dive into this very exciting topic in just a moment. I have a few little housekeeping things for you all. Mainly that we are going to have the wonderful Claire Goss speak to us about fall gardening. She has received quite a few wonderful questions from you all. So some of them will be addressed in her presentation. She will get to them all, and then we will have time for extra questions at the end of Claire's talk. And so you are welcome to submit those questions using the chat box, but we won't actually address them until the end of the talk. So submit them whenever you want, but just know that we'll get to them in due time. I'll read them out to Claire. And if you happen to have a really complicated question that you're like, I just have to say that out loud, you can just use the raise hand feature and I will let you unmute and you can ask your question out loud. Claire, is there anything else before you begin? I think that's all my housekeeping. I am going to mute myself and pass it along to Claire Goss.
Okay, well, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening to chat about fall gardens. Just to introduce myself, I'm Claire. I am the horticulturalist at the Brew Creek Centre, where we have quite extensive landscape. I am the lead horticulturalist for Nicholas North Golf Course for their gardens. I've been landscaping in Whistler for 12 years, so pretty familiar with all the challenges and things we face in our climate here. So in this talk, we're going to be talking about what we need to do in our gardens for the fall. Kind of mid-September to early November is a fairly busy time in the garden. Springtime being the other really busy time, from like spring cleanup and getting everything planted and growing, and then summer kind of takes care of itself. And then in the fall, there's a lot of tasks and chores that need to be done that will make our lives easier in the spring, and also to ensure that our plants are going to have a safe and comfortable winter. I'm going to just touch on a few topics pretty briefly. Going to cover the three main plant groups, which is annuals, perennials, and trees and shrubs. A little bit about lawn care, some of my fall favorite flowers, and then we're also going to be talking about, well, Jeanette said we had some questions come through, so I've got some answers ready to go for those. So I'm sure we've all definitely noticed there's a bit of a shift in the weather lately, even though there's technically still 12 days of summer left. It does definitely start to feel like fall already. Some of the deciduous trees are already losing their leaves. Some of the colors are changing. And I've definitely noticed in my garden, a lot of the flowers have definitely slowed down with their blooming. And also to anyone that has a vegetable garden, you're probably noticing that you're really ramping up to your fall harvest now. So fall is pretty exciting time in the garden with a lot of stuff happening, but also a lot of stuff's dying back. So it's a bit of a combination of things. So first group of plants is annuals. So annuals are the plants that you plant or buy from the store in the springtime. They live all the summer and then they die back in the fall. And that's it, they die. They just die. They don't last through the winter. They're not going to come back this year. You pretty much, as soon as there's a frost or a hard frost, you just chuck them in the compost and that's it. So that's anyone that maybe like hanging baskets this year. Most of the plants you have in hanging baskets, as soon as the weather gets cold and there's a frost, they're done. Anything like sunflowers, all these plants, as soon as it gets cold. So some are a bit more sensitive. So even I've noticed some of mine have already started to turn yellow. They're not dead yet, but they're starting to turn yellow. So I'm just pulling them out of the garden as they start to turn brown. I always feel that no plant looks better than a brown or dying plant. So I think it's just better to get rid of them. So that's annuals. That's pretty easy. Chuck them in the compost. The next group of plants is perennials. So perennials are the plants that grow up in the spring, live all summer, and then die back in the fall, stay dormant over winter, and then come back again in the spring. Perennials are things like hostas, black-eyed Susan, sedum, echinacea. There's a whole big family of perennial plants, a lot of herbs, oregano, things like this. They're all perennials. It's always a really great idea to cut your perennials back in the fall, cut them to the ground, or cut them a couple inches, so just the stems are a couple inches tall. Perennials, they will die back at different rates. So things like my daylilies, for example, they're already turning yellow and brown, and it's not that cold yet. Hostas, as soon as there is even a light frost, they're going to start turning yellow. Black-eyed Susans, they can handle quite a few frosts before they start to die. They don't even really start to die back until later in October. So as the different types of plants are starting to die back, it's good to kind of cut them out one at a time rather than just go to a garden bed one day and just, I'm just cutting everything out today. I think it's a nicer idea to kind of just cut the ones as they go, as they're dying. Another good reason to do that is because ideally you want to make sure the plant's starting to die back naturally before you cut it down yourself. As the plant starts to die back naturally, it starts putting nutrients back into its root system. And that's what's going to help it stay healthy during its dormant period in the winter, so it can sprout up again in the spring. So yeah, just as different frosts happen in the fall, you'll notice the different plants. And once they start to yellow, that's yellow, or even sometimes they get a bit mushy, that's a great time to cut them back. You don't have to cut your plants back in the fall. You can leave them intact. However, then in the springtime, it's a big gooey mess and you have to cut them back eventually. So it's much easier to do it now in the fall than try and deal with it in the springtime. And there's a whole lot of other garden chores that need to be done in the spring. So anything that we can do now is a good idea to do now. Now with perennials, I had a question from David came in about protecting your perennials over the winter. So some plants are a bit more delicate, and if it's really hard frost or lots of ice on the ground, the plants can get damaged. So one thing that I like to do to protect my more delicate plants is when I'm cutting back all the foliage from my perennials, is instead of cutting all that foliage and taking it to the compost pile, is cutting back that foliage and laying it down on the crown of the plants. So you're basically using the plant material as a mulch. It does look a little bit messier. So until you get the snowfall that's going to cover it up, it will look like you have chopped up plants lying on the ground, but it's healthier for the plant. It's going to be a mulch. It's going to be like a little blanket protecting it from the really harsh ice that builds up, especially too if it's somewhere by a roadway or a driveway that it might get covered in gravel or salt from the road. Having that little protection layer on it is really going to make a big difference. And then in the springtime, once the snow melts, you just rake all that debris right off, and a lot of that gravel and winter debris should come with it, and then you'll have your healthy little shoots ready to go. So that's perennials. And another thing with perennials in the fall is if you want to dig them up and divide them. So perennials are generally clump forming. So every year they kind of get bigger and bigger and bigger. And after a few years, they actually really benefit from being reduced in size. So whether it's too big and it's starting to crowd out neighboring plants, or maybe you have a bare spot in the garden over there and you want to put another plant in there, you can actually dig up your perennials, cut them in half, cut them in several pieces, and actually get new plants from it. So it's actually a really economical way that you don't have to buy new plants. You can just divide and expand on the ones that you already have. The best time to do that is probably in the early fall. And the way that you would do it is you would grab a sharp shovel, dig all the way around, pop the whole thing up. And I used to be really gentle and kind of work between the roots and kind of shimmy them apart to get two nice clean plants. But in my experience, the most common perennials around here, like hostas and echinacea, black-eyed Susans, they're super tough, and sedum as well. You can just get a sharp shovel and just cut it in half, just slice it in half, and then you've got two plants. And you can put one of those back in that same hole you dug it out of, and that other one you can plant somewhere else in your garden. You can maybe give it to a friend who wants to expand their garden. or you can chuck it in the compost if you don't have anything else to do with it. But it's a really great way to fill in bare spots of your garden without having to buy new plants. And so when you are dividing, after you've cut it back, dig it up, chop it up, and then replant it. And like I said, best to do that probably in mid-fall, because you want that plant to be replanted and you want it to maybe settle in and grow a couple of little roots before the snow and the really cold temperatures set in. So you want to give it enough time. So I probably wouldn't do that any later than mid to late October in our climate zone. So that's perennials. And then the next family of plants is trees and shrubs. So anything that has like a woody stem, so a shrub is like a spirea or a burning bush or hydrangea, anything that doesn't die back completely to the ground, but has like a structure that stays year round. The general rule with these more woody plants is I tend to prune them more in the springtime rather than the fall. And the main reason you would do that is when you're cutting a woody stem or you're cutting a branch, you're creating a wound on that plant. And those plants, they heal themselves over. And if we cut it now, there's not enough time in the growing season for that plant to heal over before like really cold temperatures set in. So it's going to be a lot more susceptible to die back. So that's why it's a better idea to do it in the spring, right before the plants break dormancy, so that it has the whole growing season to heal itself. So most of these woody things I tend to leave, unless there's an awkward branch sticking out sideways or something's blocking a walkway or something, sure, go ahead and cut it off. But I wouldn't do any major structural pruning until the springtime. So that is the main plant families. Just a very quick tip about grass care if you have a lawn. Just a really quick takeaway for lawn care is try and cut your grass fairly short as late as possible in the season. You generally want your grass to be as short as possible before we get a consistent snowfall. So right now, because the temperatures are cooler and daylight hours are getting shorter, the grass will be slowing down. But you want to make sure that your grass is fairly short when you cut it. If you leave your grass long and then it snows, all these long blades of grass are going to basically flop over on themselves and it creates a mat. And then all the snowfall creates this mat. And so in the springtime, you're going to have this big gooey matted mess of grass blades that are all squished down onto each other. And that's going to make it really, really hard for the new grass to try and push through that. So if you keep it really short, then that's going to be so much easier in the spring for it to bounce back. It's also a really great time of year to aerate your lawn. So depending on how big or small your lawn is, if you have people rent aerator machines, it's basically you're putting holes in the grass so that airflow can get into the root system. People like rent machines to do it. If you don't have a big space, I used to have a friend that used to walk around with his ski poles, punching holes in his grass with a ski pole. It's quirky, but it works. It does the job and it does help. So it's a really good time to aerate. And then if you do use fertilizers, and I only ever recommend organic fertilizers, it is a good time to put down a slow release organic fertilizer. You won't see the benefit of it now, but it will just help your lawn bounce back in the springtime. So that's a quick lawn care there. Another thing I'm going to just chat about quickly is planting spring flowering bulbs. So I had a question from Susan that came in about when to plant bulbs and what the best bulbs are to plant. So if you're not familiar with spring flowering bulbs, it's things like tulips, daffodils, hyacinths, and alliums, and these are all in crocuses. These are bulbs that we plant in the ground now in the fall, and then in the springtime, they're the first flowers that come up after the snow melts. And at the Brew Creek Centre here, we do lots and lots of bulbs. We have over 100,000 bulbs on the property, and I have a shipping container with about 35,000 new bulbs coming that we're going to be putting in this fall. So we definitely do a lot. I spend basically the entire October planting bulbs. So I would do this after you've cut down all your perennials. So in your garden, once you've done thrown out all your annuals, cut back all your perennials, you're gonna have a lot more space to work with and you're gonna see a lot of bare soil. And the nice thing about the spring bulbs is they grow up and they're flowering while your perennials are still waking up. So in the springtime, when your garden's looking kind of a bit bare and there's not much going on, these spring bulbs really provide really nice color, filling all those gaps while the other plants are slowly growing up. So generally speaking, the first bulbs that are ever going to flower in the spring are crocuses, and they're small little things. Then after that, you have daffodils, and then tulips follow after that. So in terms of specific types of these bulbs that are best for the area, they they all work. Daffodils will perennialize themselves. So that means if you plant daffodils next year in the spring, after they've flowered, they'll die back and they can stay dormant in the ground and they can keep flowering year after year. They turn into perennials. Tulips, not so much. Tulips, I kind of treat as an annual. They're kind of a one and done. You plant the bulb, comes up, it flowers. For me, I just tend to throw them out the next year. You may want to keep them in the ground the next year. The flower, they can flower again. The flowers just tend to maybe get a little bit smaller year after year and maybe a bit more foliage and a bit less flowers. Some varieties of tulips are better at perennializing than others. That is making sure you're planting them in a very sunny. Daffodils are a little bit more, they can handle a little bit more shade, but tulips definitely, if you want to perennialize them, need to be in the sunshine. So the best time to plant them is anytime after you've cut back your perennials, but before the ground freezes. Bulbs are pretty hardy. The very nature of a bulb means that all of their nutrients they need are already stored in that bulb, and they're pretty hardy. I've planted them as late as mid-November in Whistler and still had great success the year before, like the year after when they come up. I could talk about bulbs all day. They're one of my favorite things, but I'll move on. So the next thing I'm gonna chat about now is I had some questions come in from Erica, who was specifically asking about pruning hydrangeas, rhododendron, and some maple trees. So some big woody shrubs and what to do with these. And just if you're not familiar with hydrangeas, actually, I have one here. This is a hydrangea. They come in a whole lot of different forms, but they're generally on a fairly solid woody stem, and they flower this time of year. So if you're looking around town, there's lots of hydrangeas in flower right now. And the nice thing about a hydrangea is the flowers actually dry on the plant. So even like well into the winter, you can still see these guys dried out on the plant. So they're a really nice, early to late fall feature in the garden. So she was asking how much can you cut back off a hydrangea? So the general rule of thumb with anything that's woody is I would never cut more than 1/3 of the plant. So if your hydrangea is 6 foot tall, I would only cut 2 feet off the top of the plant. Or if the canes that grow out from the base of the plant, if there's 6 canes, I would maybe cut 2 or so canes out of the base of the plant to encourage new growth. So if you're cutting from the base of the plant, you'd want to look for the oldest, chunkiest pieces, and you remove them so that it will encourage new growth to come up. With pruning, kind of another rule of thumb is the 3 Ds: dead, damaged, and diseased. So any of the wood on the plant that's either dead, damaged, or diseased, cut all of that out first. So once you're done with all cutting that out, then I take a step back, have a look, and then structurally kind of shimmy it in from there. However, in saying that, with hydrangeas, I tend to cut my hydrangeas in the early springtime rather than the fall. So like I was saying earlier, that if you cut now, the plant doesn't have enough time to heal over and it's more susceptible to die back. So I would leave your hydrangeas until early spring, so right before they break dormancy. So depending on the weather, it's usually late March or early April. I'm out cutting hydrangeas when there's still snow on the ground, and then it'll encourage all like the nice new fresh growth for that season. The only thing that's a little different with hydrangeas is some flower on old wood and some flower on new wood. And I had a couple of questions about hydrangeas come in. So hydrangeas that flower on new wood are actually a lot easier to prune. They're the ones that every year, the new growth that's going to flower on that. Ones that flower on old wood means that the growth that grows this summer won't get a flower on it till next summer. Now, those ones are a little trickier to prune. You'll generally want to cut a lot less off them. Now, if you're not sure what type of hydrangea you have, whether it's old wood or new wood, the first year I would just be experimental and just prune it back a little bit and pay attention to where you cut and to where the new foliage grows out of, and just see if it blooms or not. Takes a little bit more time, and you can get 2 seasons out of a hydrangea that doesn't bloom, but it's just a little trial and error to figure it out there. Then the next question she had was about rhododendrons. Now, actually I have 2 questions about rhododendrons as well. So rhododendrons, whilst they are a woody shrub, they're a little bit in their own family in terms of pruning. So rhododendrons and azaleas, that you would prune them differently than other plants. So with most woody shrubs, you can prune off 1/3 of the plant. With rhododendrons, you'd really only take off 10% of the plant at a time. They don't like being pruned so much. The only real pruning I would do is structural pruning. If if there's a branch going awkwardly or something's going sideways, cut it off. Anything that's dead, damaged, and diseased, I would cut it out. And again, I would do that in the early springtime rather than the fall. And then beyond that, I don't really prune them. I would maybe do a little trimming here and there to tidy them up, but I tend to leave them pretty much on their own. I did have a question come in from Wendy about she sent actually a photo, can't share it with you, but her rhododendron was showing a lot of browning on the leaves. And to me, that looked like it was scorched. It's really hard to diagnose like plant diseases or issues without actually kind of really knowing all the factors. But to me, it looked like it was scorched. And so that leaf scorch on a rhododendron is what happens when the plant's under stress. So we had a pretty extreme summer this year. So maybe scorch could be either not enough water, or it also could be too much water. So it's the same symptom can be seen for either too much or not enough. Also too much direct sunlight. They do prefer a dappled light, and we did have a really extreme summer. So in previous summers when we had more cloud cover and more moderate weather, it might have been more healthy. But this summer, because it was so hot, may have just been too harsh on it. They're also really susceptible to wind burn as well. So if it's in an area that got wind or too much sun, that could have also have done that. And the other thing that can really affect azaleas and rhododendrons is too much salt in the soil. So a lot of treated water, like just from our municipal water, is treated water, and they add salts to it sometimes. That can build up in the soil. And also as well, if you're using a non-organic fertilizer. So non-organic fertilizers are often based on salts because it's a really effective way to deliver the nitrogen things into the soil, but over time it builds up and it's really detrimental. So I would definitely only recommend using organic. So Wendy, I would maybe have a little Google search on leaf scorch and another thing called winter burn. And there's two things that I thought that might potentially be if you want to have a look at that. So that was Wendy's question. And now let's see. So Barb sent in a couple of questions, and first question that Barb she was asking specifically about a specific plant called Lucifer Crocnia, which they're one of my favorites. And for anyone that doesn't know what this is, it's a perennial, and this is the flowering bud of it. It's kind of at the end of the season now. It usually has a lot more red on it, but these are actually really pretty, and they get about over 1 meter tall. And Barb was saying that her Lucifer Crocnias, they're finished flowering, they've all flopped over. Okay, so Barb, I have a lot of these, and mine are also all flopped over. Once the clumps get large, you need to stake them. So any of mine of these, and I have quite a few, unless I stake them, they're actually all flopped over as well. When they're young and the clump is small, they tend to stay upright much better on their own. But as the clump gets bigger year in year, they just get heavier, and it's just what they do. But you also asked about dividing them, which that will also solve the question of them flopping over. If you dig them up and divide them into smaller little plants, then they definitely will stay more upright next year. And do that the same as any perennial. I would wait till it starts to die back naturally a little bit, wait till the stems start to brown, then just chop them a few inches from the surface. And then with a sharp shovel, just dig out clumps, and then you can replant them or share them with your friends. And then next year you'll see that from the smaller plant, it'll, it won't necessarily be healthier, but it will definitely stand up more, and then it will start the cycle again of year after year getting bigger and bigger. So that was your Crocnia question. And then also we had a question about lilac trees. So lilac trees are beautiful. They flower in the springtime. So a lilac can either be a shrub or a tree, depending on the form it's been pruned into or the species of it. And Barb was saying that her lilac hasn't flowered this year. So the thing that I found is the biggest reason why a lilac doesn't flower is insufficient sunlight. So they are considered a full sun plant. So they need to be situated in an area that gets full sun exposure. So it's a minimum of 6 hours of direct sunlight a day. And depending on whether it is in your garden, maybe some other trees or things have grown up and is now blocking some of the sunlight from it. So if that's an issue, if it isn't getting enough sunlight, you might consider moving it to a brighter spot or pruning back some of the other things around it that are maybe shading it out. Another reason why it might not be flowering is if in the springtime it was pruned too hard. So even though they do need pruning from time to time, if they're cut back very hard, they may need a full season to recover. So if you pruned it really hard, maybe it skipped a year this year, but next year it should get back on track. And then the other reason why lilacs sometimes don't flower is too much nitrogen in the soil. So if it's close to a lawn, and if you're using a non-organic nitrogen fertilizer on your lawn, that could be building up around the roots of the lilac, and that could be affecting that as well. Something else that I've heard works, I haven't tried it myself, but lots of people add Epsom salts, just like regular bath Epsom salts around their lilacs. It's basically magnesium in Epsom salts, and I know that lilacs respond really well to magnesium, so you could give that a try. So that's those questions there. And I had a question from Melissa about dahlias. So I don't know if everyone has dahlias in their gardens or not, but they're definitely one of my favorites. This is actually a dahlia here that we have at Brew Creek, and they are, in my opinion, one of the happiest, sunniest, beautiful plants you can have in your garden, but they are high maintenance. And so Melissa was saying that she has dahlias in her garden for the first time this year. She knows that she needs to dig up the tubers, but she's not sure what to do with them. So yeah, Melissa, you're absolutely right. You do need to dig them out of the ground. So dahlias, they grow from a tuber. It looks like a little potato. And you plant that in the spring. It grows into a beautiful plant all summer long. And then as soon as there's a hard frost, it's just going to completely die back. But we can keep these plants year after year, and we can even expand on them year after year. We just need to give them a bit of care. So as soon as there's a hard frost, you'll notice instantly overnight, the plant will turn black and wilt and get mushy, and they basically just disintegrate in one day almost. And as soon as the plant has done that, that's the best time to dig it up and lift the tubers. You can cut them out earlier if you need to, but again, letting them die back naturally is going to start to let them put their nutrients back into their root system, back into their tubers, so they'll be better for the following year. So once it's turned to mush, you just get a shovel and dig it out, and you'll end up with a little clump of tubers. Usually you just plant one tuber, but then over the course of the summer, it multiplies itself in the ground, and you'll end up with a clump of tubers. I would usually just kind of roughly brush off all the big clumps of dirt, as much dirt as I could. And then I sit them on newspaper in my garage for a couple of weeks. So just to dry out a little. Down here at Brew Creek, we have almost 700 dahlias. So it's quite a big process for us digging out of the dahlias, that it takes us several days digging them out and then several days again processing them later. So I would dig it out. I just put them on the floor, like on newspaper on the floor of the garage, and I just let them dry out there. And I let them do that for a couple of weeks while I'm doing all my other chores. So while the dahlias are drying out, that's when I'm planting bulbs and cutting back perennials and the rest of it. And then a few weeks later, once the weather's really cold and I don't want to work outside anymore, I go back into the garage, and then with those dahlias, I dust off the rest of the dirt. Now, I don't dust it off to the point where they're completely clean. I just want to make sure that there's no worms and stuff in like the little nooks and crannies. Just want to make sure that all the moisture's out, because we're going to store them all winter. So if there's moisture in there, they could rot. It's kind of gross, but I definitely often dig out like worms and other little bugs that are stuck in all like the little cracks in there. Another thing too I should mention is make sure you label them. So if you have different varieties of dahlias, once you've pulled them out of the ground, for the most part, the tubers all look the same. So if you have red ones or yellow ones or pink ones, just so you can even just get a Sharpie and just write it directly on the tuber, what it's called. And then, yeah, so after I've dusted off all the dirt, I put them in a crate. Like I just get a milk crate or something that still has like airflow in it. You can use a cardboard box. I would put holes in the cardboard box for airflow. I line it with newspaper, put the dahlias in, gently close it up. You still want airflow. And then I put it in a garage. I mean, ideally, they should be stored between 3 and 5 degrees at 40% humidity. It's pretty specific, so we don't all have the ability to do that. But just here at Brew Creek, I just put them in just a normal garage, and I set the thermostat on 3 degrees for the entire winter. And I put a big sign on the door telling no one to open the door if it's a really cold day. There's a lot of information on the internet about dahlias and storing them in vermiculite and peat moss, and there's so many different ways you can do it. And over the years, I've tried all sorts of different methods, and for me, just simply putting them on newspaper in a milk crate works fine. Sometimes you do lose them over the course of the winter. Some of them may dry out, some of them may rot a little. I mean, that's, you can't avoid that sometimes. And then once they're away for the winter in the garage, I just kind of leave them alone. I may check on them once and twice just to make sure that they're doing okay. So I'll I'll squeeze them. I'll just grab a few and I'll squeeze them, and they should feel just as firm as when you pull them out of the ground. If you squeeze it and it's mushy, it's rotten. Throw it out so it doesn't contaminate any of the other ones. And I'll just visually have a quick look, and if I see any mold or anything forming, I'll just take those ones out and separate them so that they can't affect any of the other ones around them. So that's Dahlias. Melissa, I hope that answers your question. They are a favorite of mine, so I could talk about Dahlias all day, but I shall move on. So that was Dahlias, and then what else do I have here? I feel like I must have been talking really fast. Okay, so one of my friends, Fiona, actually put in a question to me earlier today, and Fiona was wondering about peonies. And Fiona has a large bush of peonies that she would like to divide or relocate. So peonies are they're a favorite of so many people, but they are very finicky, and peonies can be a bit of a pain to work with sometimes. You need to be really gentle with them. So they are a perennial, and where I was saying before with some of the other perennials that I just dig them up and cut them in half and replant them, you can do that with peonies, but you have to do it a bit more carefully. They are a bit more fragile. They don't like being disturbed. So if you're going to dig up your peonies, Fiona, I would recommend doing it several weeks before a hard frost. So now or in a few weeks from now would be the time to do your peonies. You want to make sure your peonies have enough time to root in the ground a little bit before the really cold temperatures set in. So as soon as the foliage starts to yellow a little bit, cut it down to a couple of inches. And then when you dig up the clump, you want to be really gentle. You really want to try and not disturb the root system too much. And once you dig it up, you'll see that there's little eyes on the surface. So they call them eyes, just like little nodes, and that's where next year's growth is going to come out of. When you're separating it, other plants I just cut in half with a shovel, but with a peony, with my fingers, I'll gently work through all the soil, and I'll basically try and shimmy the plant apart rather than harshly cutting it. I try and very gently separating it. And if you are going to divide it into several new plants, you want to make sure you have at least 3 or 5 of these little growing eyes in a piece. If you just pull off a little nugget and replant it, it's probably not going to do anything, or it's not going to do anything for several years. So you want to make sure that you get a good sized piece that has a couple of these growing eyes on it. And then when you go to replant it, it definitely is a very sunny location. They like full sun, and they like really well-drained soil. So depending on what the soil in your yard is like, they're really good on a slope. So if you have a steep slope, slopes always tend to drain well. So if you put it at the top of a slope, it's a great place. Or if you have sandy soil, that's okay. Just make sure you don't put it somewhere where it's wet and boggy soil, because they'll just rot. And when you replant them, you just want to make sure that you just cover it just slightly with 1 inch of soil. You don't want to bury it in the ground, because those eyes won't come up. So a lot of people often plant their peonies too deep and they don't perform well. So you just under the surface is what you would want to do. Now with peonies as well, they don't like being moved. So if you are digging up and dividing them, you probably won't get flowers the next year. It could take 2, possibly even 3 years to get flowers back out of that plant. So every time you move a peony, you're definitely sacrificing at least 1 or 2 seasons worth of blooms out of it. So make sure you think hard about where you want to put it in its forever home. And another thing about peonies is when they do start blooming, when you see the buds on a peony, they often get ants on them. Ants are attracted to peonies. They have a sticky coating on the bud. That's actually a really positive sign. So if you see ants on your budding peonies, let them do their work. The ants are protecting the peony bud from other insects coming to lay their eggs in the nice soft petals, as well as the ants eat off the sticky coating, so that it actually helps the bloom open up. So that's something to keep in mind with that. And I think that's everything I had on my list to go through. I feel like I went through that fairly fast. So yeah, if anyone has any other questions, or actually, you know what? I was going to talk to you about some of my fall favorite gardens, fall garden favorites. So even
Claire, sorry, can I interrupt for a second? Before you do that, we can't wait to hear. I'm just going to remind everybody that they're welcome to use the chat to submit questions if they would like. And I will also remind everybody that we are recording, and I am going to send the link to everyone who's here tonight. So if you're like frantically scribbling notes, you don't have to worry. You can listen to the recording as many times as you need to. So just a quick reminder about that. Okay, go on.
Okay, so even though this was more about things that you need to do in the garden for fall, I thought it'd be fun to share some of the plants that I like to see in the fall in the garden. So maybe if you don't have these in your garden next year in the springtime, you can plan to extend the bloom life of your garden. So just because the weather's changed and it's cold and we're maybe not spending as much time outside, definitely doesn't mean that you can't still be enjoying your garden. In fact, I really encourage people to, even if it's cold and wet and things are starting to die and look mushy, get out there. And I know it's the full life cycle of a plant. So I think they should be admired in all their stages, not just their spring growth, their summer show, but their fall dieback too. It's all part of the beautiful nature of what a garden is. So some of the things that are flowering right now. So I showed you the hydrangea already, which, like I said, hydrangeas come in usually white, pink, sometimes blue, and there's a bunch of different forms of hydrangea. But like I said, these hold their flowers. I have sometimes these hold their flowers all winter long. Pretty cool. Something else that is flowering right now, which is really fun, is Echinacea. So this is an Echinacea here. And now what's really cool about these guys is even once there's a frost, these petals are going to fall off. But when the petals fall off, you're left with this really cute cone. You can't really see the color of it, but it's actually got some nice bright orange tones in it. And you can actually leave these like little cone bits up in your garden for months, and they look really neat. They actually work really well in dry flower arrangements. Something else. Now it's not blooming right now because it's too early. This is called Summercenfuga or Actacia, and it's they get really, really tall, and these bloom really late in the season. So this one hasn't even opened up yet. So this actually is going to turn into a whole bunch of little white flowers. They're heavily scented. They smell like sugar and honey, and all the pollinators love them. And so this is something that doesn't flower. I think this one's still a couple of weeks away. Where are we now? September. I don't get these flowering in my garden down here until mid-October. So mid-October, when a bunch of other plants have already died back and everything's yellow, that's when these guys come out to play. So that's a really nice late season addition to the garden. Another kind of quintessential favorite fall flower is Black-eyed Susan or Rebecca. So these guys, they can actually handle quite a few light frosts before they fully die back. And you see these everywhere in this, so they're a staple. And these are a great perennial that you can really easily dig up and divide and spread around the yard. Now, a fun other little take on that is this guy here. So this is also a Black-eyed Susan, just a different color one. So this is a perennial. This one here is just an annual. So I start these seeds in the spring, and they won't come back next year, but they still will survive quite a few frosts before they die back. So this is a nice flower that you can have in your garden well into, I know, early October. And I think it's, they are really beautiful fall colors to have in the yard. Something else that's really fun is called Snowberry. So Snowberry or Symphocarpus albus it's actually a native plant to BC. So you do see them on the side of the road in the forest sometimes. Common name is Snowberry. And so they get these beautiful white berries on them. Even after all the foliage has died back, the berries still stay on the plant. And they don't usually turn to mush until sometime during the winter. So that's just like a really nice feature to have in your garden, these nice berries. Just a note, they are very toxic. So don't eat them. They could kill you, but they're very attractive. And then another thing that's a really late flower in the season is sedum. Now there's a bunch of different types of sedum out there. This is probably one of the most common ones. It's a type of succulent, but it is super hardy. You can grow these in really cold climates. And in terms of a perennial, every year the clump gets bigger and bigger, and you can be brutal with these. You can shovel these in half into a million pieces, and they'll all reroot and take. And these are a really wonderful thing. They're just, for me, they're just starting to open up in my garden now, and these will stay pink and flowering until after a couple of frosts. So these are some of the latest performers in the garden. And I think I had a question from David earlier. He was actually mentioning sedum and how to protect it in the winter. And I find for me, they are very hardy. I've never had a problem with a sedum not coming back, not surviving. If you do have trouble with them, I would just mulch over it after you've cut them down. Once they've died back naturally, cut them down and put some mulch over it. And by mulching, you can just cut off the stems and just put it back on and then clean it up in the spring. And that's that. So if anyone has any other questions or anything they'd like to contribute.
Thanks, Claire. I have had a couple of questions come in. Now, you already answered Fiona's, so that one's taken care of. And you answered sort of half of Amelie's because it was the same as Melissa's about the dahlias. But more generally, she said, I'd love to know which perennial bulbs I should be removing in Pemberton.
Perennial bulbs, like to dig out of the ground. The only bulbs that I dig out of my garden are dahlias. I don't know if there's like particular types you're looking for, because anything else that's like a true bulb, like lilies, they all stay in the ground. I don't need to take them out. The only reason I would take out a lily is if it's in a very wet soil and is prone to rotting. You could take it out and replant it in the spring. But if it's in just medium to dry soil, you wouldn't need to do that. So yeah, I'm not sure if there's a particular type of bulb, but
she did mention Dahlia, so I think, and please feel free to unmute yourself, Amelie, if we're not answering your question correctly.
If it comes to Dahlias, I take them all out. I don't leave any of them in ever.
Okay, thanks, Claire. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure Dahlia was the only one I needed to look after more specifically. Thank you.
Yeah, they don't like to freeze in the ground. They're very susceptible to rotting. So if they freeze, as soon as they defrost, they generally just turn to mush. And dahlias are one of the more valuable flowers that we have, and so I tend to baby them a little more.
Thanks.
We have a question from Kim, who asks, how close together, I believe, how close together can you get away with planting spring bulbs? I see some gardens with spring blooms very close in bunches rather than a few inches apart.
Yeah, so you can absolutely get away with placing them pretty close together. So I know when I'm jamming tulips into a hole, yeah, there's probably maybe even less than an inch space between each bulb. Depends what you're doing. So here at Brew Creek, we grow a lot of flowers for the use of like cut flowers. So not so much in the landscape, but also to cut and put in a vase. So that means I want to grow as many flowers as I can in a small square footage. So I jam them in less than an inch apart. Also too, when you put them that close, when they start to grow, they're competing for sunlight. So it actually stretches them. So you tend to get longer stems. Now, if you're planting tulips in like the landscape, just so your garden looks attractive in the landscape, I would space them further apart then, just because you get a bit more bang for your buck with like impact of color, not having them jammed in. If you are having them really close together, you do need to pull them out and harvest them before they're fully open, because some tulip bulbs open up quite large, and if you've got them crammed in, they don't actually have enough room to open. So that's another reason. If you have big ones, I would space them out a bit more. But if you're planning to use them for cut flowers, you'd be harvesting them before they're open anyhow, so you can get away with putting them really tight.
Good to know. Wendy just has a quick question, which is, what was the name of the last late fall plant you mentioned? Is it Sedum? S-E-D-U-M?
That's correct, Sedum, and there's a big family of sedums. They're generally white to pink flowering. This one here has green foliage. You can get varieties that have a really dark purple foliage. The Sedum Autumn Joy is one of the most popular ones that you see around town.
Cool. Tamara is wondering, what do you recommend for maintaining wildflowers? Mine are a mixture of annuals and perennials, a coastal wildflower mix.
Yeah, so like when you have the mix of annuals and perennials, it is only going to be the perennials that are going to come back next year. So you will need to continue adding seed mix every year if you want to get the annuals coming up. Places where I've done wildflowers, I put a whole bunch of different seed mixes together. So there's like through West Coast Seeds, they have quite a few different packet mixes, like there's like the Pacific Northwest mix, there's the Xeriscaping mix, there's a bunch of different mixes, and I usually just put them all together. And at least when you do that, whatever's right for that environment for that particular season, some things are going to really excel. If you have like some of the perennials that are really common in wildflower mixes, like lupin and things like that, I would later in the summer, when you see them going to seed, I would actively collect the seeds and sprinkle them around. I wouldn't just leave it up to fate to let nature do its thing. I would grab the seed heads and sprinkle them around, maybe even throw a little topsoil on. I would do that later in the summer and the fall, and then in the springtime I would keep putting more seed mix to make sure you still get those annuals popping up every year. Poppies are really, really good in wildflower mix as well.
All right, the next question is from Sue, who is wondering, can you overwinter geranium and begonias by bringing them in? In here? In as in inside your house, I assume.
So houseplants are not my specialty, but I know that you definitely can overwinter geraniums inside as a houseplant. I would generally cut them back a little bit. I know that when I do, I have geraniums under lights inside, so I have like artificial grow lights, and that works. I'm not sure how it works just the same like on a windowsill or household lights. You would definitely need to have it close to a light source, like a windowsill, so it does get natural light, but often too, a windowsill in the winter can be cold and you don't want that cold coming off. So you might have to find a sweet spot in your house where you get the balance of light and heat. You generally, they go a bit more dormant, so they're not going to be growing vigorously as they do in the summer. They kind of stop growing, so you don't need to water them as much. I mean, you need to water them a little. You don't want the soil to fully dry out, but you just need to water them sparingly. And I probably wouldn't fertilize or anything really get into the spring when it starts actively growing again. With begonias, I do that. They grow from a corm, it's not a bulb, it's called a corm. It's like a little nugget, I guess. And I would wait for the foliage to kind of die back naturally, and I would cut it off, and I would just dig that corm out of the soil, and I would dry it out, just put it on a surface at room temperature for a couple of days so it dries out, and I would put that in a paper bag and I'd put it in the garage next to my dahlias, and then I would replant it again in the spring.
I'm learning a lot. This is all new to me. We have another question in the chat from Kate, who is wondering, how/when do I get some garlic growing this fall?
Garlic, yeah. So plant it at the same time you would plant your tulips and daffodils. So I was actually meant to mention that when I was doing spring planted bulbs. So generally with garlic, you want to plant it like a bit later in the season. If you were to plant garlic right now, it's still a bit too warm, and that's actually going to start growing. You don't want it to grow until next spring. So you want to put the garlic in the ground when the ground's pretty cold. So you can wait until the end of October to pop your garlic in. And it's really easy. You have like the garlic, that word, the cloves of garlic. You maybe want to like till the soil up a little bit so your soil is like kind of like nice and workable, especially if it's cold. The top layer of the soil could even be a little bit frozen. Just break it all up, and then just with your finger, just poke holes in it, maybe an inch and a half deep. Pop the garlic in, cover it up, forget about it. It'll come up in spring.
I'm going to try that one. We have another question from Fiona, who is wondering, how can I keep cut flowers longer in my house? I cut the bottoms regularly, but are there any other tips?
Yeah, so I mean, cut flowers, different flowers have different vase life. So say for example, a dahlia is only going to last in the vase for a couple of days no matter what you do, but something like a gomphrena or something like this can last 2 weeks in a vase without even trying. So different flowers are going to last for different times, but cutting the stems is really, really great. Keeping the water clean, so changing your water. So some flowers, like they secrete stuff out of the bottom of their stems, which basically poisons the water for other flowers. So you want to make sure you're changing the water daily or every couple of days to keep them as fresh as possible. And you can also put flower food in the water. So the little packets that you get from the florist. If you don't have that, basically you can just put like a little like dissolved sugar. Because like the sugar is like basically feeding the flowers. And then another thing you can do, which actually sounds counterintuitive, but it works, is a tiny little bit of bleach in your vase water. So I know it's weird because you think that bleach would maybe not be great for fresh plants, but the bleach actually helps keep the water clean. And so that the plants are sucking up clean water rather than water that's getting contaminated with all the murkiness of the dying flower. So a little bit of bleach and a little bit of sugar and clean water can definitely extend your vase life.
That is a very fun fact. I definitely didn't know that one. Thanks, Claire. Folks, we have time for a few more questions. So if anybody has another burning question, go ahead and type it in the chat. While we wait to see if any more questions come in, I do want to mention that the Friends of the Whistler Public Library are selling tulip bulbs right now. So they are doing their annual tulip bulb sale. It's on Library Plaza every Saturday in September while supplies last. So if you want bulbs, I would go this Saturday. I know a few people who are planning to go and load up. So they will be on Library Plaza between 11:30 or 11 a.m. and 3 p.m. This Saturday and every Saturday in September while supplies last. And of course, proceeds benefit the library.
But there's some pretty nice varieties available as well. So I know that the Whistler municipality, as well as a few other landscaping companies around town, donate their bulbs. Here at Brew Creek, we also donate a lot of our bulbs to these guys. And I remember in the spring digging out a couple of thousand for. Ooh. So there's and there's some pretty nice varieties in there as well. So I definitely encourage, if you haven't tried spring bulbs before, it's really easy gardening. In the fall, you just dig a hole. And actually I didn't talk about this earlier with the bulbs, but when you are planting bulbs, basically you're digging a little hole, and most bulbs go around 4 to 6 inches deep in the soil. General rule of thumb is, depending on how big the bulb is, you want to double the depth. So like some bulbs are really, really little, so you only need to put them a few inches under the surface. Some bulbs can be quite large, so you have to put them a bit further. So you basically just, however big the bulb is, you just double the height, and that's how deep you're going to go in. So I just like dig a little hole, pop it in, cover it up, and then you forget about it to the spring. And then after the snow melts, you'll see beautiful, beautiful things happening in your garden.
I should also mention that the bulb bags are $5 each, and it's cash only. So make sure you visit the ATM before you go to Library Plaza. We've had another question come in from Wendy, who is wondering, what type of organic fertilizer do you recommend? And should we fertilize before snow or wait until spring?
So organic brands that I really like, there's a brand called Gaia, Gaia, and they have a whole plethora of wonderful products. We use a lot of their stuff here. The one that I most commonly use is the Gaia Glacier Rock Dust, and it's literally just a bag of really fine dust of ground up glacier rock, and it has all the trace minerals in it. Another really wonderful brand is called Alaska, and Alaska, a lot of their fertilizers are based on fish products. So it's organic, it's kind of gross. A lot of it's fermented fish guts. So it doesn't smell great, but it's really, really great for your plants. It's really great for the planet. And then another brand that I use a lot it's called BC brand, and BC brand also make a great, have a whole bunch of wonderful products. And like I said, I'd really just recommend only using organic. And I mean, it's better for your plants, better for your soil, and definitely much better for the environment and our health as well. Sorry, what as organic fertilizer? Oh, and then in terms of when to fertilize, I fertilize my lawn in the fall, but the rest of the plants I'll wait now until spring. Everything's dying back now, so there's no real need to fertilize it now. The only fertilizers I would do now is amending trace elements. So main fertilizers, you're putting nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium into your yard. They're like the 3 macronutrients that often get depleted with plant growth. But then there's all the other like minerals and stuff that you need, like manganese, calcium, all these other things. But they're like trace elements, and unless you have had like your soil tested to know what you're lacking and what to replenish, or unless you can really identify nutrient deficiency diseases in your plants, there's not much point in adding more of these trace minerals without actually knowing what you're amending for. That's why something like that Gaia Glacier Rock Dust is really great, because it is a very neutral all-arounder that has all of this, but it's all kind of very slow release and very organic. Something to keep in mind with organic fertilizers is they are much more gentle than synthetic fertilizers. So if you're used to putting a strong synthetic fertilizer on your plants and all of a sudden having big, strong plants that are full of flowers. When you're using an organic fertilizer, it's a much more gradual process. You're not going to see the overnight flashy results, but it's a much more sustainable way to achieve your results. It builds the soil rather than degrades the soil. The only time I would ever say it's acceptable to use something that's non-organic is like hanging baskets. In a hanging basket, you have a lot of plants that are all squished together in a very small area. They don't have much soil to grow in. Their roots are all tangled with each other, and they're just an annual. You're only going to water it or fertilize it for a few months, and then you're going to throw it out in the fall. That's the only time I would use a synthetic, but I still wouldn't recommend it. Go organic.
Claire, we've had a couple of people ask about the fish-based fertilizer attracting bears. Have you had issues with that?
I haven't, touch wood, so far I haven't. I try and time it with my irrigation and with rainfall. So it's with the fish fertilizer, it's a liquid, or it's actually gross sludge, but then you dilute it into a liquid, and then I walk around with a watering can and I water the plants with the fish fertilizer in it. And then after maybe half an hour or so, I'll run my irrigation system so that any of the fertilizer like fell on the foliage and stuff can get washed off into the soil. So it does minimize some of the smell. It is still there, but for me, I mean, I'll fertilize and then by the next day the smell is gone. But yeah, so I haven't had any bear issues yet, but.
And if someone's concerned, would you recommend going for the glacial rock one or going for one of the other ones you recommended?
Yeah, probably. Yeah. So the things like the glacier rock dust and the BC brand, like it's like that's pellets. So it's like slow release like pellets that they don't have like the fish smell. But all the different types of fertilizers, they all have a different nutrient profile. So like when we have our food, we have like a nutritional panel on the back. They all have a different nutritional panel. So depending on what you're doing, like some specific plants have different needs and things like that. But I'd say that rock dust is probably the most, I use it for everything. Yeah.
Good to know. Rosemary is wondering, how do you spell the plant that smells nice but hasn't flowered yet?
Oh, Semi-Saphiga or Echinacea. You know what? Let me Google this real quick. So,
accuracy is key.
it's been, for years it was called Semi-Saphiga, and then now recent horticulture has actually changed the botanical family of what it fits in. So the Latin for it's changed. Echinacea, so Actaea, and I guess I didn't know this, but the common name for it is bugbanes.
I'm just typing that in here. Bugbanes. Actaea. Oh, did I miss a C? Echinacea.
Yeah, Actaea.
Okay, yeah, I got it. Thank you, Rosemary, for that question. And, we've had a question from Sharon asking, is it possible to bring in from outside herbs to keep them growing through the winter, like thyme, parsley, or oregano?
If you have lots of bright light, yes. However, they're not going to grow all season. They will eventually die out because they are all perennials, so the ones that die back in the fall and come back in the spring. The plant needs that dormancy. So perennials can't just grow indefinitely. They will run out. So things like oregano, like they're gonna go to flower. So usually like later in the season they flower. Once a plant flowers, it then starts to set seed. Once a plant has set seed, its life cycle for that season is done. So if you keep trimming the flowers off and not letting it ever set seed or even go to flower, you can extend the foliage, like the foliar growth longer, but it's not, they're not going to stay as healthy as if they're outside. I mean, you could definitely try and see how you go, but I would say by the end of December, January, they're going to start looking pretty sickly and pretty sad, unless you have a grow light or something that you can put them under. I would say a better course of action with these plants is to, before the frost kills them off, I would harvest them all and dry them inside, so you have dried herbs for the winter as opposed to trying to rely on the fresh.
Okay, just a couple more questions as we approach 8 o'clock here. Kate is wondering, Kate has a pink heather in a pot. Should I put it somewhere particular for the winter?
So yeah, like heathers are cold hardy. They can definitely withstand this climate. However, in a pot, it can be a little trickier because when a plant is planted in the ground, it's insulated. It has lots of soil around it and snow builds up. So it's a bit more insulated. If you have something in a pot, it's much more exposed to the cold air. So all the root system that's in that pot, there's a tiny little thin piece of plastic or ceramic or whatever your pot is, exposing it to the cold air. So if you want to, you could potentially plant it in the ground, so like dig a hole and plant the plant in the ground, and that can be its new forever home. Or if you're wanting to keep the heather in the pot, you can, we call it like heel it in. So basically you could dig a hole in your yard and plant the pot. Like you can put the whole pot with the plant in the hole, leave there for the winter, and then in this, like if you like to have your heather on your patio or something, then in the springtime you can dig the whole pot up, wash it off, and then put it back on your wherever you like to put it. But I would definitely try and insulate the pot somehow so that the heather has a better chance of not getting too cold and freezing. And the best way to do that is putting it in the ground.
All right, and let's say this is our last question of the evening from Sandy. It seems like a good one to end on. What do you recommend for growing bulbs in containers, especially locations of pots over winter and preventing rot?
So yeah, you can definitely put bulbs in pots. I definitely don't put them super close to the edge of the pot. So just for the same reason, the edge of the pot's not insulated. So that bulb at the edge of the pot is going to be much more likely to be like freeze thaw throughout the season, and that can cause the rot. Anything that it just has freeze thaw can rot. Bulbs can get frozen solid for months and they'll still perform in the spring when they thaw out, but you don't want the freeze thaw to happen. So that's why we plant bulbs so deep in the ground, so that once the ground's frozen, they stay frozen until the spring. So pots can be a little bit more tricky to mitigate with that. I would say the larger the container, the better. Small pots is going to be a lot more harder to regulate the temperature in there. So the bigger the pot, the better. And in terms of rot, like, I mean, drainage is really important. So whenever you have a pot, you want to put like drainage in the bottom to make sure there's holes so moisture can escape. And I usually put like gravel or rocks as well, so it creates like a drainage layer, so that even if your pot's sitting on the ground, the water table in it can't rise. You always want the water draining out of it. The other thing with pots that can be a little tricky, which I've had experience with, is critters. So critters love to eat bulbs, like squirrels and chipmunks and stuff. They tend to get into pots much more than they do into the actual ground. So if you have a lot of critters in your yard, I would, once you've planted them in, I would maybe put like a layer of chicken wire or something over there so the critters can't get in, and then you can just lift that off in the spring.
All right. Thank you so much, Claire. I think we've covered a lot of ground tonight. Thanks to everybody who submitted questions. As I said before, we are recording this discussion tonight, and I will be sending out the link to everybody. Please feel free to share it with friends who weren't able to come tonight. Claire, we really appreciate your expertise, and I hope we'll have you back in the spring. Who knows, maybe in person. Let's cross our fingers. But I would like to say another big thank you to everybody for coming out tonight, and I will remind you all one more time of that Friends of the Library bulb sale, Saturdays in September, 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. on Library Plaza, $5 a bag, cash only. Get your bulbs while they're hot. And we will look forward to seeing beautiful library bulbs coming up in your gardens. Hillary has just raised her hand. Hillary, do you have a last minute question, or do you just want to say thank you? You're welcome to unmute yourself if you'd like.
I really just want to say thank you so much. This was so inspiring and so wonderful. You just answered every question I had in my mind. Thank you so much, Claire.
Thanks, Hillary.
Thank you, Hillary. I learned a lot as well. I only have a vegetable garden, so all of these other questions are purely hypothetical for me, but I so enjoyed this. And I think it's about that time that we say good night. Thank you again to Claire, and happy gardening, everybody, and hope to see lots of you in the spring for another gardening talk.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Cheers.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.